I've always loved camping. There's something peaceful about being alone in the woods, far from the noise of the city. But after what happened last summer, I'll never go camping again. I had driven out to a remote forest I'd read about online. The reviews mentioned its stunning beauty and isolation. Perfect for me. I set up my tent near a small clearing by a lake, far from the main trails. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, painting the sky with orange and purple streaks. The silence was beautiful, broken only by the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. As night fell, I lit a fire and cooked dinner. The stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen. I sat there, sipping coffee and feeling completely at peace. Around 10 p.m., I heard it. A twig snapping. I froze, the cup halfway to my mouth. The sound came from somewhere behind me, deep in the trees. It could have been an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Someone or something was walking in the woods. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound confident. "Is someone there?" No response. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but tall trunks and underbrush. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, my flashlight trembling in my hand, scanning the forest. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to the fire. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, leaving the fire burning outside. It felt safer that way. I laid there, listening, every little sound amplified by the stillness of the forest. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. My breath caught in my throat as I lay there, paralyzed. The breathing was slow and heavy just outside the tent. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves as whoever or whatever it was moved. I reached for the hunting knife I always kept with me, my hand shaking. Suddenly, the breathing stopped. The silence was worse. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound, but there was nothing. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were too long, like it had been stretched. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I ducked back into the tent, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Running into the woods seemed like a death sentence, but staying here felt even worse. Minutes passed. Long, agonizing minutes. And then I heard the zipper of my tent. I screamed, slashing out blindly with my knife. I hit something solid, and whatever it was let out a guttural growl and inhuman. The tent shook violently as I scrambled out the other side, leaving everything behind. I ran blindly into the woods, branches scratching my face and tearing at my clothes. I didn't care. All I wanted was to get away. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a dirt road. A passing truck stopped, and the driver, an older man, looked at me like I was insane. "There's something in the woods," I gasped. He didn't ask questions, he just nodded and told me to get in. The next day, I returned with the police to retrieve my gear. The campsite was trashed, the tent shredded, and my belongings scattered. But what chilled me the most were the footprints. They weren't human. The prints were enormous, with claw marks dug deep into the ground. The officers couldn't explain it. They filed it away as an animal attack, but I know the truth. Something was out there that night, and it wasn't human. I don't go into the woods anymore. Sometimes, though, I wake up in the middle of the night. Sure, I can hear breathing just outside my window. A few years ago, I worked night shifts as a delivery driver. One cold winter night, I was on a lonely stretch of road surrounded by open fields. It was almost midnight, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the dark. As I turned a bend, I saw her. A woman was standing on the side of the road, waving desperately. She was drenched, her hair clinging to her face as though she'd been caught in a storm. But what struck me most was the sheer emptiness around her. No cars, no houses, just her in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. Rolling down the window slightly, I called out, "Do you need help?" She nodded quickly. "Please, I need a ride. My car broke down." She looked terrified. Her clothes were soaked, and she shivered in the cold. Something about her made my stomach twist, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. She climbed in silently and sat with her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Her eyes darted nervously toward the rearview mirror every few seconds. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "Where are you headed?" She hesitated. "Anywhere but here," she whispered. Her voice was shaky, almost trembling, and it made my skin crawl. I glanced in the rearview mirror, curious about what she kept looking at. It's when I saw it. A shadow was sitting in the back seat. At first, I thought it was just the poor lighting, but as I kept glancing, I realized it wasn't my imagination. It was humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head too large. It sat hunched, leaning forward, like it was watching me. I slammed the brakes, jerking the car to a halt. The woman screamed, clutching the dashboard. "What are you doing?" "What is that in the back seat?" I demanded, pointing to the mirror. She froze, her face turning pale. Slowly, she turned her head to look behind us. The shadow was gone. "You saw it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Tears welled up in her eyes. "It's been following me. It doesn't stop, no matter where I go." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What is it?" She shook her head violently. "I don't know, but if you drive fast, it can't keep up. Please just go." Against my instincts, I hit the gas. The car roared to life, speeding down the empty road. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror constantly, and I felt the same dread building in my chest. Then it was back. The shadow appeared in the back seat again, its outline clearer this time. Long fingers with sharp claw-like tips rested on the seat behind the woman. "Don't stop," she screamed. The shadow leaned closer to her, its head tilting unnaturally. I drove faster. gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The shadow didn't move, but its presence filled the car, oppressive and suffocating. Suddenly, the woman turned to me. "Let me out, now!" "Stop the car!" she yelled, fumbling with the door handle. I swerved to the side of the road and slammed the brakes. She flung the door open and bolted into the darkness. I sat there, gasping for air, unsure of what to do. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and clawed, rested on my shoulder. I screamed and jumped out of the car, leaving the door wide open. As I stood there in the freezing night, the car's interior light illuminated the back seat. It was empty. I didn't wait. I got back in, locked the doors, and sped away as fast as I could. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. I never saw the woman again, but I sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I check the rearview mirror a little too often. And every now and then I swear I see something moving in the shadows. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the shadow. I told myself it was over, that I had escaped, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A week later, during another late-night delivery, my truck's radio started acting up. Static crackled loudly, drowning out the music. I adjusted the dial, but it wouldn't clear. Frustrated, I turned it off, but even then I could still hear faint whispers. They sounded like a woman's voice. "Help me." I slammed the brakes, my heart racing. The road was empty, surrounded by open fields just like before. I looked around, expecting to see her again, but there was no one. Shaking it off as exhaustion, I kept driving, but the whispers didn't stop. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt a heavy, oppressive presence. It was like the air in the truck had thickened, making it hard to breathe. My palms grew sweaty on the steering wheel, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned a corner and froze. Standing in the middle of the road was the same woman from before. She was drenched, just like last time, her hair matted to her face. But something was different now. Her head hung low, and her arms dangled limply at her sides. I stopped the truck a few feet away, unsure of what to do. My instinct screamed at me to drive away, but my hand refused to move the gear shift. She slowly lifted her head, and my stomach dropped. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. She pointed at the truck with one shaking finger. And then she spoke, her voice echoing unnaturally in the silent night. "You shouldn't have left me." I panicked, slamming the truck into reverse. As I backed up, she started to move toward me, but not like a person. She glided across the ground, her feet never touching the pavement. And then I saw it again. The shadow. It rose behind her, growing taller and darker until it seemed to swallow the road. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an icy dread wash over me. The truck's engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no!" I yelled, twisting the key in the ignition. The truck wouldn't start. The woman was right in front of me now, her hollow eyes boring into mine, her hand pressed against the windshield, leaving streaks of muddy water. Behind her, the shadow loomed, its clawed hands stretching toward the truck. In desperation, I grabbed my flashlight from the seat and shone it at them. The woman let out an ear-piercing shriek and vanished into thin air. The shadow recoiled, retreating into the darkness. The truck roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I floored it, speeding down the road as fast as I could. But I knew it wasn't over. As I drove, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. The shadow was sitting in the back seat again, its glowing eyes watching me. I've stopped driving at night since then, but sometimes, even during the day, I feel it. A cold presence. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I've come to realize the truth. You don't escape something like that. You just wait, hoping it doesn't catch up with you. Because it always does. It was late at night and I was driving home after a long road trip. The highway stretched endlessly, flanked by thick forests on either side. My gas tank was nearly empty and there wasn't a town in sight. Finally, I saw a flickering neon sign. Gas station. Open 24 hours. Relieved, I pulled in. The place was eerily quiet. The old building looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The single overhead light flickered as moths buzzed around it. I glanced around. No other cars. No one at the counter. "Hello?" I called out. No response. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. I needed gas, so I swiped my card at the pump and started refueling. The pump groaned loudly, the sound echoing into the empty night. While waiting, I felt it. A pair of eyes watching me. I spun around, my heart racing. There was nothing but darkness. Then I saw movement. A figure darted between the shadows near the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, hunched over, and unnaturally fast. For a moment I thought it might be an animal, but its silhouette was wrong. It had long, bony arms and legs, and its head was tilted at an odd angle. I froze, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Suddenly, I heard something behind me, a faint scrape, like nails on metal. Slowly, I turned around. There it was. The figure was crouched on top of my car, staring down at me with glowing eyes. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing jagged teeth. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground. Then it let out a screech, a high-pitched, blood-curdling sound that shook me to my core. That was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I bolted for the gas station building, slamming the door shut behind me. Inside, the air was thick and musty. The fluorescent lights flickered, barely illuminating the cramped space. I crouched behind the counter, trying to catch my breath. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The screeching grew louder, and then came the banging. Whatever that thing was, it was pounding on the windows, rattling the glass. I could hear its claws scraping against the door. I searched desperately for a weapon. My hands closed around a rusty tire iron lying on the floor. The banging stopped. The silence was worse. I knew it was still out there, but I didn't know where. And then I heard it again. Not outside. Inside. A soft scratching noise came from the back of the store. My stomach dropped. How had it gotten in? I gripped the tire iron tightly, my palms sweaty. Slowly, I crept toward the sound. every step feeling like an eternity. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. When I rounded the corner, I saw it crouched in the aisle, its back to me. It was tearing apart a bag of chips, its bony fingers moving with unnatural speed. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I screamed and swung the tire iron as hard as I could. The thing screeched and twisted around, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran. Bursting out of the gas station, I didn't even stop for my car. I sprinted down the highway, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that thing. Eventually, a passing truck picked me up. The driver thought I was crazy when I tried to explain what happened. When we passed the gas station again, it was gone. No sign of the building, no sign of my car, just an empty, overgrown lot. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I never take late-night road trips anymore, and I'll never stop at another lonely gas station again.